Hello, Joe Kizis here. It's the 19th of January, and I want to update you on our progress at Wind Mountain. I'm going to share the screen. Okay. You see the open pit here, which is one of the two open pits on the property, northwestern Nevada, fairly uninhabited part of the state. We believe we can turn this into a near-term production opportunity, and I will be making forward-looking statements because those haven't happened yet, and that's just the way exploration is. So a little bit of background. It's located here in the northwestern corner of the state, or portion of the state. You see some of the western or Walker Lane, Gold Trend, Battle Mountain, Eureka, Carlin Trend. Wind Mountain is the flagship property for Bravada, but it's only one of 10 properties that we have. So we're going to focus on this today. So there are two important components, and this is something I'd really like to stress. We have an existing resource. This includes some material that was left over from the AMAX mining days and some extensions that we've added to the property. It's somewhere in the million ounces if you were to be able to combine the inferred and indicated, which we're not supposed to do. So I will show those separately, but it's a significant amount of material that exists that we've already identified, as well as what has been previously produced. And the alteration halo is quite a bit larger than the area of production and resource. But total ounces are kind of on the low end of what would be attractive to a large mining company. But there is the possibility for a significant additional type of mineralization, and that would be in this disseminated mineralization that forms our existing resource. It had to come through deeper parts of the deposit or parts of the geology, and could potentially be quite high grade as a vein system. We actually have been searching for that elusive feeder zone for quite a few years now, of course, and that's one of the reasons we picked up the property initially from Agnico. We recognized that it was the top of a low sulfidation hydrothermal system, and we wanted to find the feeder zone, which oftentimes is much, much higher. So we recognize that to get the maximum value out of this property for our shareholders, we really needed to do two things. One, advance the resource, which would be the kind of the rapid amount of cash flow in a more rapid fashion. But we also needed to get a much larger story here, and that would be more significant for much larger and potentially much higher grade cash flow material for longer term cash flow. So what we've done over the years is kind of search for that feeder zone as we were at the same time expanding some of that lower grade resource material. So in 2021, after actually making our first discovery of vein mineralization on the property late in 2020, we drilled a series of 17 holes. So 13 of those holes were designed to test portions of the existing resource that were under drilled and potential expansions of that resource. A portion of that resource is quite a bit higher grade, and so we wanted to make sure we get credit for all the expansion areas of that. And 4 of those holes were designed to offset the deeper vein mineralization. Okay, so let's first take a look at the existing resource. Those 9 holes were designed, like I say, to search for higher grade portions of the property that were not really given credit in the 2012 resource estimate in PEA. So we were successful in doing that. I'll show you a bit there. One thing when we look at the details, we find that some of the fracture zones have quite a bit higher grades. There are certain structures that allow the fluids to pass through, more fluids to pass through, And then, of course, they disseminate in between those high flow areas. The grades are lower. And so understanding those is, I think, a key point to getting an accurate estimate of grade of the deposit. Some of those fracture zones are quite high grade, 1 to 10 grams gold and 50 to over 300 grams silver. So I think that tells us something about the feeder, that it's certainly carrying a lot of gold, and that'll be the key point is where would we find that major fluid flow pattern. So right now we've done that infill drilling, resource update, and a PEA for a portion of that, which we consider that as a starter pit, if you will. And we're scheduled to get that underway in February of 2022. So just a little bit of background. Here's a view looking at the wind pit, the Breeze open pit, and the resource area basically covers these two. There's a picture of me standing at the edge of the pit. And one thing you can see in this photograph is there are structures in this little light colored area here. These are some of the zones where fluid flow was more intense than, say, on each side of it. And we see that in the grade. And so that structure might be 1 to 3 grams. The material on each side of it is more than likely less than a gram. So our initial resource kind of lumped everything together. And there are certain horizons that have better values than other horizons. So we tried to break that out and get a resource, we think, which would be more attractive than the 2012 preliminary economic evaluation that we did. And of course, the high-grade feeder is something we'll be talking about a little bit more. Just a little bit more background. Almost 300,000 ounces of gold, 1.8 million ounces of silver were produced by AMAX. And here's the breakdown of the resource that we have right now: indicated, inferred for gold, and silver, and the economics at that time. So obviously this is 10 years old. It's time to update it. But before we update it, we wanted to make sure we get full credit for some of the extensions that we felt were important. So let's take a look here. I won't go through this in detail because we're going to be updating it, but if you're interested, it's on our website. The resource in gold, the resource in silver, indicated category, and inferred category. They did do in the PEA a calculation of what happens with gold price. So looking at $1,300 gold, $24 silver. That's the that was the 3-year average at the time we did the study. We get closer to today's prices, and you can see the the resource becomes more valuable based on a net present value and an internal rate of return. So it is leveraged to the price of gold, more so than silver, in part because the recovery in a heap leach for silver is quite a bit lower. So this is what the deposit looks like as it's modeled. So the yellow are inferred categories, so those tend to be wider space drilling, and then the better drilled or more densely drilled material here in red, those are indicated. So the distinction is important because indicated is a category that you can do pre-feasibility studies on, and a lot more detailed studies on both the economics and that sort of thing. The pit that was designed for the PEA is shown here. This is based on $1,300. We recognize that these two blocks of mineralization were probably connected, and we did drill some holes in there to connect those. Those haven't been added to the resource base yet. And you can see there are other areas here with some pretty strong mineralization, but the drill holes, which are these gray lines here, show that there's really not much drilling in that area. So when we take a look now with a little bit sort of an update of what our targets are looking like. One thing we do is look at what happens when the price of gold goes up. What kind of a pit would there be? And you see that even with not very much drilling, we would also start picking up some of this mineralization just based on what was outlined here. We saw the same thing here when we look at the details of the mineral blocks. There were blocks that were not carrying some very good grades. And so that's why we did that drilling project, to show that some of those will extend into those blank areas where we're not being given very much credit, just based on the statistics by the engineering company. And our feeder zone, as it turns out, is not under the thickest mineralization, which is one of our initial thoughts on, well, that's the logical place for it to be. When we did drill those deeper targets that were just based on where the thickest mineralization is, we went into fresh rock. So pretty obvious that wherever the fluids came up, they spread out laterally quite a ways. And when you look at the geometry of the mineralization, it tells you to take a quick, much closer look at the area to the south. When we did that, we recognized that kind of an odd alteration that we didn't quite understand is actually pretty classic steam heated alteration. It doesn't, not associated with, the area of the largest amount of mineral blocks. There's none of that particular alteration here. Now this forms when a fluid is boiling at depth and the gases come off and really destroy the rock. That suggests that maybe we should look at this area as the potential feeder. And we did some additional work and we had an idea that, that is probably one of the major sources for upwelling fluids. So again, just kind of a summary. In last year, you can see there's a ranch off to the west of us, and otherwise it's a pretty desolate part of Nevada. Taking a look at the results of our drilling, we, the first phase of our drilling, I guess I'll pull back here one slide. This cluster of holes here, this is the breeze pit. The black dots are places where there were holes, and there were some, significant blanks in the drilling here. So we filled those in, and here's the indicated average resource or average grade, 0.377 gold, 8.9 silver. You can see we got nice thick zones. These are in meters, 21 meters, 0.4, 15, almost 0.5, 44, 0.4, 67, 0.4, 50 meters, 0.6, 47 meters, 0.7, including 10 meters of 1.3, and some pretty high silver values that go along with the gold. So really, this is what we wanted to get credit for in the next round of resource. Again, some extensions here, 65 meters of 0.4 and 77 meters of 0.5. So some good values. The feeder zone, our initial holes, they're pretty similar to what some of the real low-grade material is, and we think that's just leakage from around the feeder zone without actually intersecting the feeder zone at this level. So I'll explain a little bit more about that next. In 2020, our final hole, fourth hole in the area here testing the feeder target, actually hit the first banded vein that we've seen on the property. And the best intercept within that was 1.5 meters, 0.4, but 269 ppm, grams per ton silver. And that was within a much thicker zone of banding with anomalous gold and silver. So this is pretty unusual, particularly these high silver values. And when we look at it under the binocular scope, we see that those are sulfides, so probably argentite. So this is something very unusual. First, the quartz, instead of being real low temperature, sort of silica flooding, we're seeing distinct banded veins. And those banded veins are indicative of boiling at depth. And boiling is how you get high grades. You get repeated sealing, breaking. Every time it breaks, gold and silver drop out. So our 2021 holes, we had some sites that were already permitted. And since we didn't know the orientation of the vein system, we drilled from those areas. Unfortunately, they all shallowed a bit. So we hit basically the same elevation as this 102 hole, or even shallower. Typically, the silver would drop out a little bit higher than the gold, and the gold would be basically depleted by it got to that elevation. So our hope had been to drill underneath that same horizon and see if the gold values picked up. And then, unfortunately, like I said, the holes flattened, and we're not able to do that. what we were able to do, though, is to identify the quartz zone, the banded quartz vein, and we're able to extend that for a strike length of over 300 meters. So based on that, the geochemistry and the fact that we did identify the boiling zone, or the extension of the vein zone, we were able to permit new sites that will allow us to have the proper access to drop deeper. So we've now received the sites, permitted sites, the addition to our existing permit. And there's supposed to be a rig available March or April, and we can do that deep test at that time. So show you a little bit about that target. This is the south end of the pit. The resource blocks continue down in this area here. This is a geophysical map right here. And we knew this feature was something that indicated there was probably a structure going through here. We had no idea whether that was relevant to mineralization or not. We had an idea that the feeder zone was somewhere in this area here for a number of geologic reasons. And in December of 2020, we drilled this hole. We drilled into a rock that is, we're missing 1,200 feet of a unit that wasn't there. So we were trying to scratch our heads figuring out what kind of structural setting would do that. As we drilled this, we realized, well, no, actually that is a horizon that was never deposited in this area. In other words, this was a mountain high, and the rock that should have been there was never deposited on that high. So after we drilled these 3 holes, we drilled this hole 102 because we knew there was a structure somewhere in there. We wanted to see if that was important for mineralization. When we drilled across it, that's when we got that high value. We then looked at a little bit more carefully at some of the holes around it. There was a historical hole out here that had 7.6 meters of about a half gram gold and over 10 grams silver. Pretty similar to what we got on this end in our final hole before we lost it, actually in the top of this fault zone here. So we drilled those holes. We have some idea of where that mineralization is, but it also gave us a very good idea of what was going on across this structure. So we're going to look at a section, basically a slice of the earth across there. That's what we see here. So on the far east end, this is where we have the steam heated alteration. We know there were steam fluid, basically steam plume coming up to the surface and really destroyed the rock there. I'll show you a photograph of that soon. We knew they had we had a resource off in this area. And with our drilling, if we look at silver, which tends to be a little bit more at this high level, a little bit more coherent, what you see is that you've got the basement rocks here, Mesozoic rocks, and looks like the fluids came up along that fault zone there and then spread out laterally in this direction. Now, this basement uplift is something that you couldn't predict on the surface. You don't see any evidence from mapping, but it's an important point because this is a very, very dense rock. Fluids just are not going to go in here unless there's a major structure. And so the thought that, where's the fluid going to most likely come up? It'll be along the edge of that structure. And that seems to be the case here. So our model now is to, that we really only just tested the upper portion of this, but we really want to catch this contact between the dense rock here from the Mesozoic basement and then some of the volcanic rocks that are down dropped against it. So this is what the ground looks like within their photo. This is a heap leach, one of the heap leach pads from AMAX. This is another heap leach pad. These are silver values and drill holes. This is the structure that we mapped. So basically the uplifted basement rocks here, the downdropped tertiary rocks over in this area. So we're going to take a look at this cross section right here, EE prime. So again, this is the upper part of this vein system here, very high silver. The idea is to test underneath that, where we're going to see, hopefully, that those fluids are going to be migrating up along the edge of this basement uplift and boiling when they kind of break through that area into the less constrained volcanic rocks of younger age. Okay, so just a couple of photographs showing, what the evidence is and what it looks like, and that this is the steam heated alteration. Very classic, so early stage silica kind of cements the hosting rock, and then the blocks of what used to be volcanic rocks that were incorporated in this very coarse, very poorly sorted conglomerate have been leached out by the acid fluids that formed after the boiling occurred, and were sending off very caustic fluids to deteriorate those blocks, giving you that sort of Swiss cheese look. This is what the veins look like when you actually get into the vein zone itself. You get multi-stage, nice delicate banding. Again, fairly low temperature quartz, but distinctly quartz as opposed to just silica flooding in the rocks. Here's a sulfide rich band here. Here's a dark band here that may actually have some selenium minerals in it, giving it the darker color. This white zone in here could be adularia. So, a little bit of quartz after calcite boiling texture in that fragment there. So pretty, pretty indicative of repeated boiling. And it's that sealing and boiling, sealing, fracking, and boiling that causes gold to deposit. And so the evidence that we're above the boiling zone in here, based on a lot more silver than we're seeing gold, and the fact that there is boiling would indicate that the gold dropped their fluids primarily deeper. Now, not all of the fluids were, depleted of gold, and some of those spread laterally while they were still carrying a large amount of gold. And the reason we know that, I mentioned some of the fractures earlier when we were looking at our resource to the north, but this came from the bottom of the wind pit. So a fellow is doing his thesis work, collected this sample from the bottom of the wind pit with our permission, and did this study where he basically cut out this little block here, which we see here. And you can see this little iron stained fracture right there. There's another fracture there. It's a little bit hard to see in this slide right here. But he did a technique called laser ablation. And basically what that does is it maps out where different elements are. So it's almost like taking a little point analysis at each of these little dots, dotted areas like that. So as it maps it out, what you see here is this is what the gold looks like. And of course, that is that iron-rich fracture. That other little fracture that's a little bit harder to see is here. And these are significant grades here. This is 30 grams, 1 ounce per ton in red. So you see a little bit of that, ½ ounce in yellow, quite a bit of that. Not much in between. Some of these values in here are in the 2 to 3, 2 to 4 gram per ton range. So this is why it was such a good heap leach run of mine operation, because all you have to do is fracture so that you open up these fractures as gold goes in the solution. And so you don't need to really grind the rock very, very fine to expose those surfaces to the leaching fluids. We see the same thing with silver, even more so. That's 100 ounces per ton, basically in yellow. So very, very high grade, a little bit lower grade than this other fracture. Mercury, arsenic, some of the other elements are associated with gold deposits. We can see that those are associated with fractures as well. So that early silicification really is pretty interesting, because it basically provided a nice brittle area that is fractured and fluids kind of spread all over the place. That dilutes the grade, of course, the farther it spreads out, but it also concentrates it along fractures, and tells us something about what the fluid that was coming up at some point where it would be having repeated boiling should have some very, very high grades indeed. So I'm going to leave it at that, a low market cap at this point. And I'm pretty excited about the drilling that we're planning to do as we go into 2022. So that's it for now. Any questions? You have my number there to call.